Welcome to Prepared for Parenthood, the podcast for hopeful, expectant, and new parents with little ones up to age 5. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Duger, a psychotherapist, author, educator, parent coach, and married mother of 2. On this show, we'll discuss everything from the most up-to-date practicals of best supporting your young children, to thriving in relationship as a family, to more surprising topics around the psychology and development of babies from conception through age 5. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome back to Prepared for Parenthood. I'm so happy today to have Diane Michel with us. She's helped mothers breastfeed their babies for more than 21 years. She's been an international board-certified lactation consultant since 2008 and also has a background in psychology and public health. Diane has 2 grown sons, and her own breastfeeding experience led her down her professional path, first as a Leche League leader, and since with her own lactation consulting practice called Nourish Lactation Consulting. So welcome, Diane. I'm so happy to have you here.
No, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I know your breastfeeding journey with your own sons really impacted you, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to share just a little bit about what that experience was like and how you chose to go into becoming a lactation consultant.
Well, before children, I worked in public health, and I was working with injection drug users in harm reduction. We were trying to help prevent HIV for folks, but in a way that really promoted their own health. And so we were really asking folks, what matters to you and how can we help you support you in the way that you want to be supported to reach your own goals? So it's a lot of training and working in a very non-judgmental way with folks, really just listening to them. I was in the midst of that field when my oldest son was born. And when he was born, we were definitely breastfeeding. And it's funny that before I breastfed, in the field of public health, I was thinking about the breast milk piece of it, thinking about what great nutrition it was and that sort of thing. And that was really like, oh yeah, I'll breastfeed because of that. When I got into it, I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot more here. And there was a lot of relationship building, a lot of curiosity that I really was noticing going on for me of who is this boy and what is he like, and how that space of breastfeeding really helped foster a lot of that relationship and the bonding between us. And so around the time that I was ending this career in harm reduction was around the time that I started going to Leche League. I knew about them from my background, and I started going to Leche League meetings when my son was about 7 or so months, not looking for a how-to at that point. We were very much established in our breastfeeding relationship, but more looking for a community. Leche League, I should mention, was founded in 1956, so it's been around for 66 years. It's a worldwide organization, and we are all volunteers through Leche League. Our local groups were just volunteer-led, and we are there to support mothers in their journey to breastfeeding. And it's really around mother-to-mother support, and really around the idea of breastfeeding as normal and just a way to respond to your baby. And so I went to these meetings and was really just surprised at how much I felt like I really need this. At the time, my friends were starting to wean, and my son was nowhere near weaning. He was not very interested in solids at the time. And I thought, we're in this for a while. And so I decided, I'd really like to support other women in that same space. And so became a Leche League leader. And then it continued on with it. So once I was a leader, I ended up going to a training so I could support other leaders in more medically complicated cases. And then that led to me becoming an international board certified lactation consultant in 2008 and starting Nourish Lactation Consulting. One experience led to another. I don't know about you. I love listening to people's stories of how they got to do what they do. And for me, it was really started around this initial piece of how important breastfeeding really was for bonding for my son, and just how much easier it was for me to bond in that space.
I love that story too, Diane, because it shows the importance of the relationship that is built through breastfeeding or chest feeding, and the importance of the skin to skin contact and how that impacts the bonding and attachment. And the other piece that I love about what you shared is the importance of social support, right? So going to these Leche League meetings, first as a participant and then as a leader, and fostering that sense of community with people who are feeding their babies in this natural, important way. And I feel like in our society here, we are often so isolated on our journeys, and having that social support is so critical. So I love that you share that journey and the importance of it. And then you had a second child as well. And was the breastfeeding journey different with that child?
I think at that point, I had a better sense of what to expect. Although every baby is different, the basics of it were clearer to me at that point. And it was just like, of course, I'm going to breastfeed. This was such an instrumental way of parenting my first son that it was just a given. And every journey is different for sure with every child and learning that child. But I think the tool of understanding who this child is in that space was really similar, the process of it. I also wanted to point out a couple of things about what you just said. You said breastfeeding, chest feeding. I'm going to talk about breastfeeding, but I do mean breastfeeding, chest feeding. It is certainly part of that same picture.
And there are so many different ways to parent, and it looks different for every family. And so just want to help people to feel included in their conversations always. You have this new birth parent who comes home and they're just starting out. What are some things that they might expect? Like, how often is their baby going to feed, for how long? And again, I know it's a little different per baby and birth weight and all of that, but in general, what can people expect when they come home?
That's a great question. It's the question I get asked often. And I'm going to just actually pull up some notes because I wanted to reference a study that was done almost 20 years ago that someone was wondering exactly that. What is the experience of how babies feed? And what she found was there is a massively wide range in how babies feed. So I wanted to just pull up some of those numbers from my notes. So she was looking at babies who were feeding and growing normally. There were no babies who had a lot of issues in this study. And she looked at babies from 1 to 6 months old. And what she found was the number of breastfeeding sessions range from 4 to 13 times per 24 hours. 5 to 37 minutes was the average length of a feed. Night feeding was normal. About 64% of babies fed during the night, and only 36% of babies didn't feed at all during the night. And she defined night as 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. She found that babies feed faster over time. She found that the total intake from 1 to 6 months remained about the same over 24 hours. And lots of other statistics, but those are some of the big ones that were really interesting to me. When I read that study, it really shows me just how incredibly different each experience is with every baby, and how if we're comparing ourselves to our neighbors, our friends, the people on social media, or like a packaged program, a lot of times we fall short. And some of the things that really catch my attention when I'm working with parents is all the shoulds that I hear and the sense of failure that a lot of families feel when they're not measuring up to some arbitrary goal or some arbitrary numbers. And so I hear should a lot when I'm in consults, and it always just sort of stops me in my tracks. And I usually stop parents and say, let's kind of explore that a little bit. What is that should, and where is that coming from? Because of that wide range of normal. And so what's really important is understanding your baby and really seeing what matters for your baby. And if needed, to work with a lactation consultant to be able to understand your baby a little bit better.
New parents often come home with their first baby and they're nervous, right? Most people haven't had a lot of experience with babies in this culture, right? We live in kind of isolated little pods, and there's so much information, so many different ways to do things. And I love that you brought up the shoulds and how we compare ourselves, because we don't have a lot of feedback often from people. And that's one of the reasons I feel like places that have community like La Leche League are so important for new parents, just to bounce ideas off and be together and talk about things that people whose children are older may not be talking about anymore. One of the things that I know a lot of nursing parents have questions about, especially at the beginning, should breastfeeding hurt, right? We often have this idea that it's this completely natural thing and therefore should be easy. But I know, yeah, should be easy. And I know from my own experience, it was not easy. And I had a very hard time, especially with our first daughter, establishing breastfeeding. And I needed a lot of support in that. And I felt kind of badly about myself that it was hard because I didn't know. And so I'm sure that as a lactation consultant, you must get questions like this, like, "Hey, should it hurt? And am I doing something wrong? And how do I make it better?" So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It should not hurt. Breastfeeding may feel tender in the first bit of time when breastfeeding is getting established. Your nipples might feel tender. Your breast might feel full when milk comes in, and this sense of heaviness and fullness. But that should go away pretty quickly within a couple of days or so. Nipples shouldn't continue to feel tender and shouldn't feel pain. If any of that is going on, it is absolutely important to reach out. That absolutely is not normal, although I'd say it's common. And, the interesting thing is when we come into motherhood, a lot of times we feel a sense of confidence in our own lives, right? We've been independent, we are doing maybe careers, and suddenly we're responsible for this little being. And there's such a tremendous weight on us. And somehow we should know exactly what to do. And I think for a lot of us, when we don't know and we're having this pain, there's this personal sense of failure, right? Of like, I should know better. I should be able to do this. I don't find that lactation is intuitive per se. There are a lot of pieces that I'm always educating families about. Like, look what your baby's doing here. This is what your baby's communicating. What if we tried this? Let's be curious and just see, is this helping? Are you able to work with your baby a little bit better once we're able to make some changes? Does it feel more comfortable? And very often parents will say, oh, yeah, that made such a difference. So I'm really encouraging parents to really notice instead of kind of having a mental checklist of here are the things I should be doing, to really notice, what if I do this? What happens? How can I help a baby get to breast with ease and comfort? There's just a lot of that going on. Yeah.
I know a lot of people choose to pump or need to pump,
Yes.
especially if they're going back to work or they want their partner to help in the middle of the night, and that there are probably a lot of questions that you get around pumping and that journey. What are
Absolutely.
the most common things that you get questions about, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. It's interesting when I do prenatal consults. It's often the first question that women ask is, what kind of pump should I get? When should I start pumping? It's, I think, on everyone's minds really, really quickly. And also, sometimes when women, if they give birth in the hospital, they might get discharged with a plan in which moms are told to feed their babies at breast, pump their breasts, pump milk, and then feed their babies with a bottle. This is especially the case when women discharge before the milk is fully coming in, is what the term is. In other words, when the milk has become more plentiful, when babies maybe still have trouble latching. And so it's sort of an insurance policy, right? The issue becomes, what next? So sometimes women leave the hospital with this plan, and then they're not told, by the way, this is a short term plan. So I meet women who have been working with this very exhausting program of what's called a triple feed, meaning breast bottle pump, without an end in sight. And I see those women and they are very frazzled. They're exhausted. They don't feel confident at all in their bodies. And so I want to get those women off of that triple feeding regimen as quickly as I can. And also uncover if they still need it, there's a reason for it. And so to go back to a point that I was making earlier about the wide range of normal, it's not to say that everything is normal. So, for example, if there's pain, if babies aren't gaining well, if babies are always asleep at breast and just can't seem to get food from breast, those are reasons to go seek out help. And sometimes there are reasons for what babies are doing that can be helped, right? And so basically, the triple feed is there as a bridge. And so if there are these ongoing issues, we want to uncover what they are so that women aren't chained to their pumps. There's a difference between choosing to pump and offering bottles and feeling like you have to pump for these reasons that I was just describing, right? The choice of pumping for other people to give bottles or when women go back to work and their babies are in daycare, for example, is something really different. And for that, if there is not a medical necessity to pump, then very often we're starting pumping a few weeks in once breastfeeding is well established, is sort of the term that some women may hear. It's usually like a month-ish in, give or take, from after the babies are born. And then we start to introduce pumping. And we may introduce it just at the time that bottles are given, sort of as a substitute. It depends on mom's milk supply and depends on the rhythm of her day. And we create a plan that's unique to her. But that's a really different thing than that sort of intentional pumping for a reason that advances a mother's goals, if that makes sense. Mhm. From that perspective, it's also important that her pump is a pump that fits her. And so something that we might work on is fitting her pump parts, especially something called a flange, which is the part that intersects with her breast, to make sure it fits her properly, because oftentimes women aren't using the right flange sizes. And so it's not comfortable, it's not effective when they're pumping.
And do you work with people with multiples? So
I do.
twins, triplets, and how did they navigate breastfeeding? I'm sure it must be different than someone who's just feeding one. What are the particular challenges that might come up and the reasons that people might seek you out?
Multiples is a whole other thing. And it's a lot of management of mom's energy, really, because it's quite a bit going on. So very often there's one multiple who's a better breastfeeder than the other, in my experience at least. And so sometimes we're really working individually, one baby at a time, to start to build skills and assess what's going on. Most moms who have multiples would prefer multiple babies to be at breast at once. And very often we're working toward that. But sometimes moms will choose some sort of mix of pumping and bottle feeding and breastfeeding, which we do very individually. We come up with individual programs for those moms. And so it may be, for example, that she might choose that she's going to feed one baby at the breast at this particular feed, and that she might pump and have someone else give the other baby a bottle and then switch at the next feed. Sometimes as babies get older and moms are more confident and their babies are a little bit more competent at breast, that's very often when we'll try to bring babies together and feed them at the same time. It looks really different per baby. But I do have to say, one of the really cool things about feeding both of the babies at the same time is as they get older, they start to interact. And again, I'm so interested at this, what's happening in the space of the breast. And so there's this relationship that not only gets developed between the mom and the baby, but between the babies as they kind of touch each other and that sort of thing. It's actually really beautiful to watch. And not to say that this has to happen or this has to be a goal, but it is a really beautiful piece of things if babies are feeding at the breast simultaneously.
And I think about multiples having been in the womb together they already have a relationship, right? They probably know each other better than the baby and the parent at that point. And
That's a
so
great
bringing
point.
them back together to have that special time must be really fascinating to watch. And then I know some people are still nursing an older child and begin nursing a baby as well. And
That's right.
I'm so curious. One of the things that comes up for me is I know that breast milk changes to match the needs of the age of the child. And so if you have an older child who's still nursing and you have a newborn who's nursing, how do people navigate that piece and what does that look like?
It's a great question. It's called tandem nursing is the concept that you're asking about. And it is related to what we were just talking about that relationship between the babies in a multiples scenario. It looks different for every family. And so there's not one right way to do that. Some moms will prioritize their newborn. In fact, most do this where the newborn gets the first dibs and then the older sibling will come in afterwards and be able to share the nursing session once the younger newborn has had a longer time because the older babies or older toddlers feed a lot faster. And so a lot of times moms want to protect that milk for the newborns first. Some women will assign one breast for one baby at one feed, for example, or they'll have the older baby come in after the newborn has switched breasts. And so they go back to the first breast. Some women feel more boundaried around it and they only allow their older child to come in at certain times of day. Some women will really feel touched out. And so they really just need to protect themselves as well as their babies. It really, really varies. And this isn't to say that this should be every family's goal. It depends on what's important to them and what works for them. But if it does, I would say that I also see this beautiful sibling interaction at breast. And, it's hard to say what causes what down the road, but I will tell you that a lot of families who do this tandem nursing will report that their children are pretty close as they get older. Who's to say if it isn't a type of parenting or something else? But that is pretty interesting to me because for me, breastfeeding is not just about the milk. It is really about relationship. And so that always perks up my ears.
And you mentioned earlier that sometimes people reach out to you prenatally for support. Are those often first time parents? Thinking back to my own experience, I wouldn't have even thought to contact a lactation consultant prior to
Yeah.
having my first baby. And so, in terms of the number of people who reach out to you at what point in time, how many come prenatally for a first visit? How many contact you in kind of crisis mode? How many contact you for a newborn versus a 6-month old?
Those are great questions. There's a huge range and all of the above. And I don't know what proportion do, but I can tell you sort of what it looks like. The prenatal consults are a mix of first time parents and parents who have breastfed their prior children. And very often those families have run into some issues, and that's why they're contacting me prenatally. But the first time parents, usually it'll be like, oh, my friend told me about you and said she wished she'd seen you sooner or something like that. Or they have a health history that they're concerned about. Or maybe they feel just a little bit more anxious and they just really want to meet with someone because they want to ask a lot of questions prenatally, feel like they want to establish rapport so that when we meet at a more vulnerable time postnatally, it feels a little bit more secure to them. So all of those reasons are kind of reasons why people would reach out to me prenatally. Those families, we will often set up a consult in the first few days of life. In that time, there's a lot of education that I'm teaching parents before crisis of like, let's try this. What if we were to try that? How does that feel? And so we're just trying to get things off onto a good start, basically. And very often before any problems arise, although sometimes they do arise in those very early days, right? And then I get a whole other group of people who you said were more in crisis. And I'd say those are more problem oriented kinds of consults. So, for example, moms are in pain and that pain is just not going away. And so sometimes they're also feeling a dread about breastfeeding because they're in so much pain. So a lot of those feelings also come up. It may be that the baby isn't growing well or that their milk supply is faltering, or maybe they have too much milk and their breasts are hurting and they're getting breast infections or other complications that are going on, right? It could be concerns on social media that are coming up that they're wondering about. Certainly when my children were born, that wasn't going on. And I think that's a whole other layer of stress and questions that come up for moms. There are questions about pumping, back to work, baby won't take a bottle, baby won't take breast. Those are the kinds of things that will often come up. Questions about tongue tie or lip tie or funky positioning that babies are in at breast, or they just can't get comfortable with positioning and latching. Those are the kinds of reasons that someone might reach out that are more problem oriented.
And do you have tips for parents who are just starting their breastfeeding journey or chest feeding journey for the first time? What are your top 3 tips that you might give to those families?
So, one of the big tips that I would offer parents is to have a community of support and think, who are your champions, who can really support you, and not just immediately say, forget it, go ahead and wean, and really just help be their cheerleaders. And also who can help with the mundane tasks of the laundry, the food, things like that, because everyone's too busy to deal with it and everyone's too busy for self-care. So we all need that kind of community. I would also think, be wary of one size fits all approaches. And if you have a plan, be willing to change it. And so for me, those are related issues, because I think when we get too rigid in our thinking of it has to look like this, it's a setup for failure. And we're also not seeing our babies. I think we're in our own anxiety and we're not able to see the baby in front of us and what is going on with that baby and what does that baby need. And I've seen way too many families use packaged programs where they say the baby should be feeding this many times a day with this much food and then sleeping for this amount of time. And I'll tell you, it's rare that babies get the message. They don't know how to do that. And so what ends up happening is the moms internalize this. I asked in one of my intake questions about how much blame moms have put on themselves. And most moms are really walking out with a lot of blame. And so this is one of the big sinkholes for that, because the package programs do not see your baby and the individual differences in each baby. And so I just worry about that dyad, the mom and the baby, and what's going on between them when they're trying too hard to follow those programs. The third tip is to be easy on yourself. There are things that are very much in our control, right? As moms, we can control when we feed, where we feed. We can control the latching and positioning, especially with some support and some tips, right? That's our body, and we can help babies come into breastfeeding in that way. Once babies have latched, and if the latch isn't going well, that's on the baby, and that's a great place to get help. But still, somehow moms, I think I should be out of pain here. I should be able to do something to control the situation, while not understanding the baby has his or her own set of characteristics and things going on that might need some support that don't have to do with the mom, right? The choice of how much that baby wants to take in, right? So a lot of moms are really nervous that they offer one breast and that baby won't take the second breast. Well, the study that I referenced earlier, there's a lot of variability. I'm going to grab a statistic, if I may, and tell you that about 30% of babies always took just one breast. 13% of babies always took both breasts, and 57% of babies sometimes took one and sometimes took both. And so I think this is another place of looking at the baby, for example, and really just trying to understand that this is actually maybe the baby's ownership rather than the mom's. And so there's a dyad, meaning the mom and baby really are a unit, And in addition, mom and baby are very separate beings. And so I think that there is sometimes a sense of relief when I'm really talking to families about who owns what. And for parents to really understand, oh, yeah, this belongs to my baby and let's work on this.
And those are such great tips, Diane, and great tips also just for parenting in general, right? Like find your community. So important to have community. Don't try a one size fits all approach because every single family is different. And see your child for who they are. Really work on that relationship. Know yourself and try not to take on too much of the mom guilt that we hear so much about or the parent guilt of just knowing that everyone's journey is a little different and we're doing the best that we can. I really trust that people in general are doing the best that they can. They want the best for their child. And sometimes parenting is really hard. Sometimes nursing
So
is really
true.
hard. Sometimes having a teenager is very hard, right? It's such a journey and it's a journey of growth for the parents and for that little one. And so to be gentle on yourself is so important. So thanks for bringing those tips up.
My pleasure. I love the way that you just framed that. I think a lot of times when I'm talking to families, breastfeeding is sort of the first milepost in that shifting relationship and those shifting pieces exactly the way you just described, which will come up again and again in the child's life. It's just this is the first place for it.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Diane, today. Could you let people know how to find you online if they are wanting to work with you either virtually or in person?
Yeah. So I'm at nourishlactation.com. And all the information is there. I do work with a lot of insurance. Insurance usually covers consults. And so for women who feel like there's a financial barrier, they should realize that whether working with me or other lactation consultants, that very often insurance will pick that up.
That's great. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prepared for Parenthood podcast today. I hope you found this episode educational, informational, and conversational, and that you'll join me again for another episode soon. If you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, I'd very much appreciate if you would rate, review, and subscribe. If you're interested in more information related to today's podcast, or are looking for parent coaching or courses, you can find my information in the show notes or online at preparedforparenthood.com.